Welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen and I are delighted to welcome back virtually author Megan Chance, whose new book, Glamorous Notions, will soon be in bookstores like the Poison Pen in January. We do have copies on order at the Poison Pen. If you'd like us to hold one or put one in the mail, just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen and we can reserve this fabulous read. Now I'd like to welcome author Megan Chance.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, Megan. My first question for you is you wanted to be a writer from early on, but your own career path took some twists and turns. What can you tell us about Megan before you actually published your first book?
Oh, well, yeah, I wanted to be a writer from the time I was very young, and I always intended to be. And then when I got into college, I took a composition and drama class, and I was used to writing papers, overnight and getting straight A's. And the professor gave me a D on the paper. And I was so stunned. That I decided I wasn't going to be an English major anymore. Now, keep in mind, I'm 18 years old, right? I'm pretty
Oh,
and pretty arrogant, and it just I was so shocked. So I went into broadcast communications instead, which was actually a very smart thing for me to do, because I think going into journalism in any way as a writer really teaches you how to write and going into broadcasting, where I became very weirdly a videographer, a news photographer, for TV news, only because it happened to be the position that was open at the time after I had done my internship as a production assistant. It ended up meaning that I was seeing people sort of at the best and worst moments of their lives. And as a writer, that also was very valuable. I was not, I don't think, a genius photographer. I, I sort of remember sitting around with the other photographers one day, and they're all discussing how the lighting should be in this theater where we were shooting concerts. And I thought, boy, I really don't care. And that was my first clue that that wasn't really the profession for me. So the news department I was working for at the time decided to pull up stakes, and I took the opportunity to go back to writing. And I took a job as a waitress and worked on writing and selling a novel. And got a job after that working for a professional photographer as his studio manager, and worked in my spare time to publish a novel.
Your first book was published book was A Candle in the Dark. Is that correct? What was it like getting that into print?
From the time I decided I wanted to be a published author until I actually was 8 years and six full manuscripts. A Candle in the Dark was my sixth manuscript that I had completed since I had made that decision. And so I had been getting a lot of really great rejections. And I think what happened, well, I know what happened was I finally kind of made a decision that if I was never going to be published, what would I do? And at that point, it was like, well, I can't really stop writing. I really love doing this. And so I'm just going to tell a story for myself, a one that, is going to speak to me fully. And I just sort of ignored all of the things that I had been taught, because at the time I was writing historical romance. So it was ignoring all the things I knew about romance. And I wrote a story about a pretty difficult love story between a prostitute and a unrepentant alcoholic. And I had it was a story I wanted to read. It was a story I really loved writing, and I had sort of no thought that it would be published. And I remember entering into the Golden Heart and got ratings back like, this is not a romance. This is, and it was the one that sold. And so it was hard. It's hard to describe how empowering and exciting and all those things it feels like to be published after so long trying. But more than that, it was this idea that it put in my head of you've got to write what it is you want to write. You really just can't sort of alter your vision for other people. And out there will be people who won't like what you write, and there will be people who love what you write. And you have to sort of do it for yourself. And if other people want to come along for the ride, then that's cool. And that was sort of the lesson that I learned from that whole process.
It's a valuable lesson for writers. Which brings me to you talking about write what you love. Let's talk about your new book, Glamorous Notions, which I loved.
Thank
What do you want readers to know about this book? What can you tell us about it?
The inspiration for this book was actually came from the book, my previous release, which was A Dangerous Education. And I had been doing research in the 50s in America during the Cold War. And I had stumbled across this stuff about the CIA and the FBI doing, taking part in cultural propaganda. And it made sense that they were using propaganda against our Cold War enemies, Russia and the Eastern powers and all that kind of stuff. But what surprised me, though it shouldn't have, was the kind of propaganda they were using against Americans, and the way they were using movies and music and art and literature to form the minds of Americans against communism, yes, but also in terms of what they thought America should be. And it was a moral directive, and it was also a religious one, and it was an intellectual one. And I found it fascinating. I just couldn't stop reading about it. And for me, the problem was, in today's day and age, we're not surprised by the fact that the CIA is is a bad agent, I guess is what you want to say, against its own people, that it's working against its own people. So how do you write this intellectual question, which is, how do you write a book about where the CIA is influencing how people think in an age where people aren't expecting that and don't know it, and get across the outrage that they feel when they discover it, when we're pretty cynical about it right now. And that was the challenge that I faced in writing the book, especially because what you can see is the way that sort of all developed how Americans think today about corporations and capitalism and family and women. And it was a tricky novel to write. It challenged me a lot in a lot of different ways, and especially when I picked Hollywood, which was my agent's idea. It tangled me all about. It was a fun novel and challenging.
Well, your protagonist, Lena Taylor, comes to Hollywood after some adventures to reinvent herself because she had a past
Mhm.
herself. And Hollywood really, it was a smart choice because so many people went there with one identity and emerged with another.
Mhm. Yeah, it's very true. And it's interesting too at the time because the blacklist was going on for writers, for screenwriters in Hollywood. And a lot of them were writing under different names. So, and movie stars were going there and they were changing their names. And it was a place to go and sort of dissolve who you'd been, at the same time that the publicity machines in the 50s in particular were really ramping up, and they were poisonous in their much more so than in the years before, where they were also big. But the Confidential, which was the magazine that really popped up during this time, was ruthless in hiring private detectives and old cops actually who were retired and who sort of went into this and really trying to find the secrets of these people, who some of them who came out of nowhere, movie stars who were getting popular, and trying to actively destroy them. And so having a secret past or another name was a very risky.
Yeah. Yeah, Lena kind of has her own entanglement with, I think it's at least one of the big gossip columnists of the
That's,
time, Hedda Hopper.
yeah, Hedda Hopper. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because Hedda was a member of the Motion Picture Alliance for what was it? The Motion Picture Alliance for American. I've lost the name, but
Mhm.
Cecil B. DeMille was part of it. And what they were concerned about was American morality, both in the movies and other places. And they were very determined to root out communists everywhere they found them. And this the things that Hedda Hopper says in the book, in the dialogue, were things that she really felt and said, about how women in Hollywood should quit working when they married and devote their lives to their children and that kind of thing. She was very much um, she was very much for the sort of idea that women's jobs were should be in domesticity and raising healthy children to fight the communist threat in America. And she could be very vicious in trying to find ways to get weasel in and find secrets about people. So
You're right. I think up until the early 30s, movies were very freewheeling and there was a
mhm.
lot allowed. And was it the motion picture code that kind of
Yeah.
instituted this whole you have to follow certain guidelines?
Yeah, it was that, and it was, of course, the Cold War and the fight against communism, but yeah, the Hayes Code, and that they were very strict about, and it was again, it was a moral issue. It was we we want to depict an America that is a moral place. You could show a man's navel, but you couldn't show a woman's, and they got around this often by using this fabric called souffle, was transparent, skin colored fabric. And the the costumers would say, "Hey, she's fully covered," you know. And but it was also like you couldn't show pregnancy, you couldn't show married couples sleeping together, you couldn't show anything related to sex really, unless or drugs, or any kind of smuggling or wickedness, unless the people involved in it were punished and hopefully redeemed at the end. And in terms of women, a woman could be an enemy fighting a man as long as she lost. She could be a criminal, or she could be a primitive child, a man's sexual fantasy. Those were the things, or a wife kind of thing. So she could be any of those things. And anything more than that, she was not allowed to be in the film. So, yeah, and they had censors on set who were making sure that this was happening. And the Hague's Code didn't disappear till 1952.
Oh,
And even then, for another 15 years, they were fighting it. I mean, it disappearing legally was one thing, it disappearing practically in what people were doing was another. And that didn't really start to happen until the rating system came up. And when was that? Like late 60s,
60.
68, something like that.
Yeah, you're right. People who don't aren't familiar with the history of movies don't realize how impactful it was. The one thing I remember, the one big movie I remember was Rebecca.
Yeah,
Hitchcock movie, and he had to change the ending from the book because you couldn't have that ending under the code, and that's
that's
just
right.
crazy.
It's killer. I mean, and when you think about the way that as a culture, when movies are a huge cultural thing, you know, everybody goes to the movies, everybody sees how this works in your head, um, subliminally, in the way that you think about everything. I mean, even really the only way you're getting away with anything subversive at all is in science fiction movies, where it's cloaked in aliens are coming down to the planet, you know, and so nobody's really thinking it's real. So it's very interesting.
I think you kind of put a little reference to that in the book with Lena's boyfriend, who's, well, to become boyfriend, who's screenwriter, whose movie is in production.
Right, exactly. And he represents, you know, the whole screen, you know, writers, um, and screenwriters, he does represent the whole sort of thing that was going on with them at the time, and uh, how careful they had to be about what they were writing, and how closely they had to stick to kind of the script of what was expected, for a movie to be, and how they could not really move out of that little narrow thing. I mean, the writers who were blacklisted, some of them were writing movies under other names, as I mentioned before. A lot of them just went out of the country, you know, and they went to England, which was much more open. They went to Mexico, they went to Spain. They were making movies in other places because you could be destroyed in America. I mean, your
Yeah.
career could be over.
Let's talk a little bit about Lena's career because I found that fascinating too. Fashion designer, costume designer,
Yeah.
movies. How did you research that? Were you inspired by real historical figures when you were thinking of Lena?
Yeah, Edith Head, of
I
course, is
was
a
thinking, yeah,
yeah, is of course. I read a lot about her. I read a lot about not just costume designers at the time, but fashion designers at the time, uh, particularly the ones coming out of Europe. Uh, uh,
Schiaparelli,
yeah,
Schiaparelli.
Schiaparelli and Landon and those. I read a lot about Dior too, and Adrian, who was a male costume designer. Flavio in the book, who is a male costume designer, is kind of modeled on him. And other ones who were coming at this time a lot, you know, the studio system was breaking down. And a lot of female designers were coming off of Broadway and changing the whole look of movies in a way, because they were coming in, and before, costume designers like Edith Head had been focused really on character theory, you know, and on how a costume reflected the character and the character's mood and the character's arc throughout the story. And uh, the Holly or the yes, the Broadway costume director or costume designers were coming in, and they were looking at a movie from an entire, holistic point of view, where it wasn't just about the character, but it was about the palette for the entire movie. You know, the colors, more from an art design or an art designer sort of point of view. So they were changing it a little bit, and the but it was interesting because Edith Head was one of the ones who she would be assigned to an actor, and that actor would insist on her being borrowed out to the other studios she was there at sort of the dying of the studio period. So, and she was really interesting, and the sort of conflicts and competition and all this kind of stuff that was going on in the 50s as everything was sort of falling apart was just really fascinating, you know? Yeah. So,
Yeah, you really give Lena a lot of interesting sides and angles because you see her working with different movie stars and how she kind of manipulates them, but they don't realize they're being manipulated into choosing designs and things
right.
like that.
I mean, that was one of the things that I was reading about Edith Head, and she was talking about the Hitchcock actress, the blonde, the lavender blonde. Oh, I
Tip
have lost
Henry?
her name. Tippy, not Tippy
Hedren?
Hedren.
No.
No. I can't remember her name. Oh my God. She was in a lot of Hitch. Oh, it will come to me.
Yeah.
But she told her when she first started working with her, I will not wear gray. I simply will not wear gray. And so Edith had 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 designed a gray palette for her. Oh, it was for the actress who was in Vertigo.
Oh, yeah, I know who you're talking
Yeah,
about.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and so what she did was she brought in a bunch of gray swatches for her to look at, and had they were designed, to match her hair and her skin and everything else. And she just slowly sort of manipulated her into, how look how good this, how well this looks with your skin and how perfectly this suits the character, and just worked her until she was, agreed on using gray, even though at the very beginning she's like, no gray. And it's such a perfect, uh, she was such a perfect character study in how to deal with actresses and actors in general. So that was fun to do. That was fun to research.
You also put in some other things that are real, like the American Art Academy, which has been
Yes.
around for like a decade, and
Mhm.
Lena, under her previous guise of Elsie, goes there to work as a scholarship student. But as a historical novelist, how do you find the balance between incorporating real historical details and bringing your own story in? Because you have to kind of walk a line.
Yeah, you do have to walk a line. And I think part of it is that you look at it in terms of, okay, I'm being as real as I can, and I'm following the facts as far as I can. And then you have to sometimes say, okay, I need to let go of this if it doesn't make sense, or if it doesn't work completely with what it is I need to happen here. I mean, I'm constantly sort of reminding myself, you're God here. You get to make the choice. You get to change it. And if it doesn't work, so make up a different place, and I love history. I love studying it. And I can go down a rabbit hole. The stuff that I have in my office and the stuff that I'm looking for I can spend days going down rabbit holes just to find something stupid like, oh my gosh, you know how much time I spent researching the Holy Year in Rome in 1950?
That's right. Yeah, because that impacts the story when she's,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. I mean, I didn't know. I picked that year, and all of a sudden I realized, oh no, it's a holy year in Rome. It's a year of Jubilee in Rome. And I'm like, what does that even mean? I literally spent days looking at videos, doing all this kind of, it's like 2 lines in the book, or like, it's like no big deal. Um, but this is the kind of stuff that you do. And you're like, can I find a way to have this mean something, or reflect something that's going on in the book that works in my favor? And so yes, you're constantly juggling what is too much, what is not enough, what walks the lines that I need to walk, that add something to the flavor of the book, or more than the flavor, to the theme of the book, and what is just me uh, playing with history or throwing history up against the wall to show the reader, hey, isn't this cool? And I think part of it is a realization that when you're writing a novel, you're creating an illusion for the reader. And the moment you do something that pops them out of that illusion is when you're like, okay, stop, you know.
yes.
And so knowing yourself when that happens, it's really hard, but it helps when you have, fellow critique partners and stuff who are going, now this is just Megan talking. So
Having written several historical novels, historical romances, do you sometimes find it interesting how history repeats itself? And the only reason I'm saying that is because you have line from the censor who's talking to um, Lena in the book, and he says it's a simple time, only simple views are allowed, as he's telling them to dumb down the movie her boyfriend is script writing and they're filming.
Yes. I, you know, in a way, to me, that's reassuring. It's both reassuring and horrifying and frightening. It's both things, knowing that history cycles all the time, and it cycles in so many ways. I mean, right now I'm working on a book set in 1925, and there's so much that's the same as what's happening now that it's almost like it just never stops happening, you know. And you can always find something in history to reflect exactly what's going on now. And I find it's just so interesting. I mean, it makes me want to say to people all the time, you know what? Read a book, you know? I mean, just go look back at history. This is not unusual. This is not different. And so I find it, yes, I find it troubling, and I find it also kind of reassuring in a kind of fatalistic way.
Oh, and that we survived it once, we'll survive
Yes,
it
yeah,
again.
that we survived at once, and that ultimately, I think reason and goodness wins out, but I think it often wins out at a terrible cost. And that's the thing that troubles me about it, is that ultimately I think, um, what matters and what's important wins. But in the meantime, what fresh hell is this?
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process for books, because if I understand correctly, you kind of have a cinematic approach when you're writing a book. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I see what's happening as I'm writing it. It's in my head. It's like a movie in my head. And so yes, I tend to write I'll write about 200 pages and then give it to my critique partner, and we sort of brainstorm what's right about it and what's wrong about it. And then more often than not, I throw it out and start over again. And then I'll get to 400 or maybe further, and the process kind of repeats itself. And I will do, any book I write, um, we're looking at least 4 or 5 drafts before it even kind of gets to my agent, sometimes more, depending on the difficulty. And then I will do another draft before it goes even into editorial. So, but yes, and I end up diagramming out chapters just to make sure they're flowing and the pace is right and everything else. It's kind of a long, sloppy, onerous process, but yeah, that's how I do it. And I essentially have people, actors, whatever, who kind of take the place of the characters in my head so I can see them, moving around. But yeah, it's like watching it appear on a screen for me when I'm writing.
You've taught writing too, haven't you, in addition
Yes,
to being a writer?
yes, yes.
What what do you try to, what's the first thing you try to teach someone who wants to, what's the most important thing you want them to get from that process?
I think the most important thing to say, beyond the fact that you're writing, the whole illusion thing, you're writing something, an illusion, and if you pop somebody out of it, you've failed. That's one thing. The other thing is just doing it, sitting down and doing it, because it's easy to write a novel in your head. I mean, it is. It's just sitting down and putting the words on the paper. And however you can do that, I mean, when my kids were young, I was writing in the time that they were taking a nap, or the time that they were going to soccer practice, or the times when they were in school. And the time that you have expands to fill whatever, I mean, what you have to do expands the time to fill the time you have to do it. So I was getting the same amount done in the 6 hours they were at school than I was in the 2 hours they were taking a nap. And that's still true. So it's just sort of, button chair essentially always. And it's easy to make excuses and say, oh, wow, I'd rather vacuum today, but it's really one of the things that I've been very lucky to have in my life is drive, and I don't think you can teach that.
Do you think sometimes too there's this people who want to be writers don't really understand the difference between wanting to be a writer and wanting to be a published author?
Yes, I think that's very true. And because, yes, because being a writer is a job. It is a job and it is a hard job. And
Yeah.
frankly, if you can do anything else, then you should probably do that,
Mhm.
because it's not, I mean, I have to come out here in my office and I have to sit down and I have to ignore everything and work on a story. For me, too, and this, I'm going back to what I said earlier, the process is everything. I love the process of telling stories. I love the process of coming up with a plot and characters and figuring out what these people are doing and getting whatever message it is in my head, whatever it is I want to say, getting it across in the best, most interesting, most entertaining way possible. But if you don't love that process, really, it's just too hard, because the rest is miserable.
Yeah.
Dealing with other people in the publishing business, dealing with the publishing business pretty much in general. I, everybody, people, I have dealt with lovely, lovely people my entire career, but it's frustrating. It's a frustrating business. And, what you're kind of hoping is that there's somebody out there, even one person, who sort of reads your books and goes, oh, yeah, I get it. You've spoken to me. But you never know, you know. So if you don't love it yourself, if you aren't writing a book just for you, it's very difficult to feel fulfilled or challenged, or to feel like it has any meaning, you know.
Yeah. I think most writers that I've heard from have said that even if they never got published, they have to write. That's
Yeah,
just part of their DNA. So,
yeah, yeah. And I feel that way too. It's just, I don't know what else I would do with myself, you know. I mean, you've got stories churning in your head all the time and ideas that are popping up all the time. I would just, I don't know, go mad, I suppose.
some writers do, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Let's talk about you as a reader because you're a storyteller and a writer, but who are some, as a reader, who are some of the authors, the books that have influenced you over the years?
Well, I have a very eclectic, weird, I read everything. I mean, I just really read everything. When I was younger, I was a big fantasy reader. I was a big historical fiction reader, as a kid, and that trans it went sort of all across the board: literary historical fiction, commercial historical fiction, romances, Mary Shelley, Susan Howell, which isn't romance, but not Mary Shelley, that's Frankenstein, but Mary uh, Stewart, Mary
Stuart,
Stewart,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Victoria Holt, all of those were big influences when I was young. And when I was a kid, I was one of those kids who just read everything. If I could sit in a chair and read all day long, that is what I would do. But I would say one of my biggest influences back then, when I was young, Susan Howitch would be a big one, a really big one. And since then, I read a lot. I've never read very much in like the New York Times list, the really popular big it books, but I've been trying to do that more and more because I feel like I should. Um, and I tend to read, I don't know, I kind of read across all genres. I was reading YA for a long time there, and I'm not so much anymore. Um, but one of my favorite books this year, besides The Women, was the Safe Keep, which I loved, and Ministry of Time, which I thought was just brilliant. And and I read a lot of old stuff too. When I get really depressed, I read old French literature in translation. you know, like I loved Balzac and um, some of the old classics, just because the French fatalism is so reassuring to me. I don't know why. I mean, look at them. They're still,
Well,
they've been through so much and they're like eating cheese and drinking wine and hey, that's all good. So, but I don't know. I read a lot. I read all the time.
I think that's important as a writer because you
Yeah.
expand your own horizons too.
Yeah.
Now you can say as much or as little about this next question because I know authors are kind of proprietary about their work, but you mentioned you have something in the works. Is that
Yes, I have coming out, uh, I think sometime in 26 is, well, right now it's called The Vermilion Sea. I don't know if that title will change, but it's set in 1925 and it's about uh, rich people on a haunted yacht in the middle of the Sea of Cortez. And it's sort of based on William Vanderbilt used to do these. He would go on these cruises on his big ship, the Alva, and he would collect specimens of marine life on the way for his museum. And it's sort of based on that with a bunch of everything goes wrong.
wow, how fascinating.
Yeah, it should be interesting. It's been fun to write.
Have you given any thought to, I know you have a lot of backlist and sometimes that's no longer available, bringing some of that back into print?
Yeah. Actually, that's kind of a prescient question because I have been thinking about that quite a bit and trying to get some of the rights back on that stuff. So we'll see. It's been a while for some of it has been out of print for a long time. So see about that.
How can readers find out more about you and your books? Are you on social media?
I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Threads. I'm on Blue Sky. Um, and it's going to be either Megan Chance or Chance Author. It's all on my website, which is www.meganchance.com.
I believe you're doing a few events for Glamorous Notions.
Yes, I'm doing an event for Liberty Bay Books in Poulsbo at the Jewel Box Theater on January 16th. And I'm doing a appearance at Third Place Books in Lake Forest Park on February, I want to say 13th. I think that's right. But that should be all up there on the events too. So looking forward to it.
That's great. Time has just flown by. You've been a wonderful guest. Glamorous Notions will soon be available in bookstores and libraries near you. I want to thank Megan for taking time to talk about her work and thank everyone for tuning into another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, John. I really had a good time. I enjoyed talking to you.